throughout culture, there's this very common misconception that science and religion are enemies. You guys know what I'm talking about? Have you heard this from people from Christians who don't like science? What kind of stuff do they say about it?
I haven't heard from Christians. I've heard it
From atheists? Yeah, it happens on both sides. I'd say more so on the atheist side, at least percentage-wise. There's way more believers than there are atheists, but the percentage of population, a lot more atheists would believe that science and religion are not only incompatible, they would say that they're enemies. They're like opposing forces, like they're warring each other, and they always have been. There's this revisionist history that goes on, where people talk about the beginning of science. They call it the Enlightenment, and they basically portray it as a bunch of enlightened individuals breaking away from faith, breaking away from belief in God, and then they started discovering all the secrets of the universe. Okay? This is a very common misconception, but this viewpoint that science and religion are opposites, that they're against each other, it's only a recent one. Okay? And it's not true when you look back at the actual Enlightenment, or when you look back at the actual founders of science. The founders of science did not view their faith as incompatible. In fact, they viewed it quite the opposite. So I'm going to list off a couple of the founders of science, okay? You guys heard of this guy, Copernicus?
Yeah.
Heard his name. What is he famous for?
Series.
Sorry?
Say about sun.
Something about the sun?
It's something about the old world and the new, or the old universe and the new universe. He separated the two. The difference.
That might be something he did. That's not what I'm thinking of, at least that he's famous for. Did you have something?
Yeah, the heliocentric theory, the Earth orbits around the sun.
Yes. Okay, so he's the guy that came up with the heliocentric theory, the theory that the Earth orbits around the sun, not that instead of the common theory at the time, which was that the Earth was the center of the universe, everything orbited around the Earth, right? So he's the one that came up with that. He also did other things, but that's the one he's really famous for. Then we have Galileo. You've heard of him?
Yeah.
Another astronomer. He helped prove Copernicus to be true. So he was able to prove some of these theories about the sun and the planets. Then you have Johannes Kepler. You heard of him?
Yeah.
Yes.
Really? Okay. What is he famous for?
Something about
He's another astronomer. He discovered 3 major laws of planetary motion. The big thing he discovered is that the orbit around the sun is an elliptical shape or a pattern. So what is an ellipse? It's like an elongated oval. So he discovered that the orbit of planets is an ellipse or an elliptical pattern. Okay. Then we have a guy named Robert Boyle. Okay.
Yeah.
This is a famous chemist.
Yeah.
And by the way, the dates underneath are the birthday, just to show you the time period. Okay. Robert Boyle, he's a famous chemist. You heard of Boyle's law?
Yep.
Anyone taking chemistry?
We took it last time.
Okay. So, you probably heard about Boyle then, in that class. He's very famous. He's the one that Boyle's law. Do you guys know what that one is?
Molecules, something like that.
It's about molecules and pressure. Okay. He's the one that figured out that the volume of gas decreases when you increase the pressure.
Yep.
Boyle's law. Okay. Here's another one. You've heard of this guy, I know. Sir Isaac Newton. What's he famous for?
Never heard of physics.
Physics. He's the father of modern physics, we call him. He also invented calculus. Anybody take calculus? If you hate that class, you have Newton to blame. No, what's cool about him is that he invented calculus kind of as a side thing. Anyway, Newton was a brilliant man. He did a lot of crazy things. The big thing he's credited for, do you guys know?
Laws of thermodynamics.
Laws of thermodynamics. Well, yeah, that too. That's big. The law of gravity. That's his big one. You guys heard? You know what he's famous for? Sitting under the apple tree, and the apple falls. And it's not like no one had ever figured out that things fall. And what happened was he saw the apple fall, and he could see the moon orbiting around the earth, and he's the first who connected the two and said the force that is moving the apple is also the same force that's moving the moon. And he realized, okay, objects of mass attract one another. And that's his big theory, which became a law of gravity, right? Very important discovery, as well as all of the other things he did. He did quite a bit. Okay, one more. Carl Linnaeus. You ever heard of him? Okay, he's important in biology. He's the guy that came up with the classification system on how to differentiate species in animals and plants. We call it taxonomy.
Oh, I remember.
Okay. Or here's the other word for it, which I never liked: binomial nomenclature.
Oh yeah, I know why you don't like that.
So he's the guy who said, you know what? There's similarities in all the animals. Let's figure out a way that we can organize them, and he came up with the system to do that. Okay, so these are all founders of what we call modern science. As you can see, this time period is when the birth of science really took place, and it started there in Western Europe. Not only were each of these men believers in God, they considered their faith as vitally important to their scientific efforts. Now, I could, if I were illogical, use a logical fallacy right now, known as the appeal to authority, which is what? I could say, look at how smart these guys are. They believed in God. You should too. That's not a strong argument, though. That's not the point I'm making, okay? The point I'm making is that those who founded science, they didn't view science as in conflict with religion. They had faith. In fact, they viewed their faith as very vital to their scientific work and endeavors. And so my point is that this viewpoint or this storyline we've all been fed that science and religion have always been fighting is just false. Okay? Here's a quote from a scientific historian. He says, it was monotheism. What's monotheism?
Believe in God.
Believe in God. It was monotheism that launched the coming of physical science, for it premised an intelligible world. What does that mean? What's an intelligible world? It means we're able to understand it. We'll talk about that in a second. They intelligible world, sacred but disenchanted, a world with a blueprint, which was therefore open to the searches of the scientists. The great pioneers in physics, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, devoutly believed themselves called to find evidence of God in the physical world. In other words, they thought God had called them to be scientists, which is a very different idea, very different than what we hear, right? We hear that, these enlightened men unleashed us from the shackles of religion. That's not how they viewed it at all, okay? And so we've got to ask the question, well, when did that viewpoint that science and religion are against each other, when did that really crop up? Okay? Well, it happened a lot later, and we'll talk about that mostly tomorrow. But these men, they connected their faith with what they were able to observe and discover. So let me give you some examples as to the kinds of things they believed. Johannes Kepler, okay? You see his name right here? Okay, Kepler. He thought that the mathematical precision of the planetary movement was evidence for an intelligent designer, for a creator. And he wrote on that subject. Robert Boyle, one of my favorites, okay? He insisted that the intricate clockwork regularity of three things: the physical laws, chemical mechanisms, as well as the anatomical structures in living organisms, suggested the activity of, quote, a most intelligent and designing agent. Okay, notice what I just said there. Three things: physical laws, chemical mechanisms, structures in living organisms. You notice that that's actually the three biggest fields of science: physics, chemistry, and biology. Boyle said, we look at these three stems of science. He says, in each one we see such precision that in his mind it was evidence for the Creator. So not only did he believe in God, but he viewed his scientific endeavor, his work, as a way in which he could prove God. Same thing with Newton. Okay, Newton is a great one too. He was actually an apologist. He would write, no one talks about this anymore. Everybody ignores the kind of the other side of Newton. They want to talk about gravity and physics, but then they ignore the fact that he would write whole documents that were arguments for the existence of God. He believed gravity itself was proof of God. Now, the way he thought of it, the way he formulated it, it's a little outdated, but it was still a very compelling argument that he put forth. He also would argue from other things, like one of the big things was the eye. He said, the way light works in our world, in the universe, and the way our eye is perfectly tailored to accept light and perceive it and understand it. He said that had to be from a designer. They were both made by the same designer. And so he used many arguments like this to argue for the existence of God. So these founders of modern science. Oh, actually, let me give you one more example. Linnaeus. He viewed the fact that animals are fit into neat categories, like mammals, amphibians, reptiles. He thought that the fact that they all fit in so well and nice together was, again, proof of an intelligent designer. They viewed their science and their faith as not only compatible, but as working together. In fact, Boyle, I mentioned, he's one of my favorites. He saw science as an act of piety. Do you know what piety is? Mm-hmm. So it means an act of extreme devotion to God. He saw science as basically a way to worship God. Because he thought, God wants us to understand the universe. And so I'm going to go out there and do it. And he really viewed it as his calling. So many atheists today, not all of them, I don't want to straw man it, right? But many atheists today like to pretend and use this revisionist history that they're in conflict with one another. But that's not how the founders of science viewed it. This idea that they've always been at war is just not true. Okay? And that's the first thing we need to take out of this. And hopefully you guys were coming in and you didn't think that way. I'm sure you haven't been thinking that way. But if you, by any chance, thought, science is the enemy, we need to dissuade you of that. Come on. It better still be recorded. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about this quote again. Okay, I read it earlier. What he says here is very interesting, though. He says it was monotheism that launched the coming of physical science. What does that mean? The belief in God is what actually led people to become scientists. Now this is, I think a lot of atheists, like new atheists, would view this as very controversial. But it's not a controversial statement among scientific historians. Because oftentimes when scientific historians look back at history, they wind up asking two main questions. They say, why there and why then? They look at Western Europe in the years 1400 to 1700, and they say this was the birthplace of what we call science. It's the birthplace of these mechanisms, these experimental methods, all of these things that were birthed right there. And they ask the question, why did it start there, and why in that particular time? Because there are certain material needs for a society to create science, okay? What do you think a society has to have materially in order for them to start creating science?
Brains.
Yes, they need brains.
Family science.
That's true. Okay. Let's think a little bit more sophisticated. Materials, like, what do you mean? Okay. So let me put it this way. If you're a war-torn country and everyone's worried about the war that's happening and we're about to die.
You don't progress because you're out of money.
Yeah. You're not going to progress because you're out of money. You're constantly preoccupied with these other things.
And you're losing lives.
You're losing lives. So is a society like that going to create science?
No, they can't.
No.
Only for war.
Only for war, yeah, that's true. So, what about wealth? Does society need to have wealth? Yes. Okay, society needs to be very wealthy for science to come up. Because, think about it, you have a whole subset of the population whose only job it is to think about the world. You can't do that if your society is just completely worried about putting food on the table, right? So you've got to be a well-to-do society, a wealthy society. You've got to be in a peaceful society. Now, what scientific historians have looked back on history and all these different cultures of the world, and they've said, we find other cultures that were like that, but they didn't create these scientific methods. It happened only later, and they said, why? What is the X factor, in other words? And a lot of these scientific historians have come to the conclusion that the X factor is actually Judeo-Christian belief. What do I mean when I say Judeo-Christian?
Christianity originating from Judea.
Yeah. So the culture that originates from Judaism and Christianity. Okay? A lot of scientific historians believe that that was the X factor. That's why it started here and why it started then. Because there were enough people in society who believed in a creator. And there are two things that come up. Two things that happen when you believe in a creator. Okay, here's what you're going to write down on your sheet. I'll tell you about the blank in a second. Two presuppositions. What's a presupposition?
Oh, it's a guess made prior based off of some reason. That's the presuppositional class, assuming that we're believers or open to believing.
Exactly. So a presupposition is we go into an argument or we go into a field of study with an assumption in mind that we all can agree on. Okay? So there were presuppositions in this society that led to science. Okay? And those presuppositions came from a belief in God. Okay? So here are the two main ones, the two big ones that led to science. Okay? The first one is called contingency. Go ahead and write that down. Now, this is the technical definition, but I'm going to go ahead and give you an easier way of understanding. Okay? So contingency. What that word means, if something is contingent, it means it exists only based upon certain circumstances. It's dependent on circumstances.
Is it kind of just like
Not necessarily. So the idea is you're juxtaposing, you're comparing two different philosophies, okay? And this was mentioned in one of the videos we watched last week, but I know it was very brief, okay? The idea of necessary versus contingent, okay? Necessary is the idea that the universe is the way it is because that's the only way a universe can be, okay? Whereas contingent the idea of contingency says, you know what, the universe could be different. It is the way it is, but it could have been different. Okay, that's the idea of contingency. I'll explain more about it in a second, but go ahead and write it down. So, this is the idea that the universe could have been created differently. I think we take this idea for granted, but for a long time, people didn't really think this way, okay? Especially philosophers and those who spend a lot of time thinking about logic, okay? I'll talk about that more in a second, but first I want to give you the second one. Actually, go ahead and finish writing. You ready for it? You guys ready for the next one? All right, the second one is intelligibility. In other words, they believed that we can understand the universe, that the universe is understandable. So the opposite of that would be a belief that the universe is just purely, we can't understand it. It's too complex, it's too chaotic, there isn't any reason behind the universe, therefore we can't understand it. Okay? So that's the opposite of intelligibility. Go ahead, write that down. By the way, if you want to fill in the blanks of the first statement there, can anybody guess what it is? Many today would claim that religion and science are
Incompatible.
incompatible. Enemies is the second one.
Enemies the second one?
Yeah. So incompatible is the first blank. Enemies would be the second blank.
Oh, I was thinking, that's the opposite. I almost had it right.
All right, so let's talk about these two presuppositions, okay? Contingency, the idea that the universe could have been different. Why do you think this is an important presupposition to have if you're going to create science? Any guesses?
You get your brain thinking about exploring
Yeah.
what's different. You think.
Yeah, exactly. So we look back at the Greek philosophers. I know we've talked about them a lot. They believed in the logos, right? When we talked about that. They believed that there was an underlying order to the universe. But the key difference is they believed that that order was necessary. In other words, it could only be the way it was, and it couldn't have been different. And many of them viewed the universe as self-existent, and they thought the logos was self-existent. It just is. It can't be any different. And so what that meant was their science didn't ever progress because they thought they could sit back and think deductively only. Right? You know, deductive, inductive, okay? Mm-hmm. See, we laid so much groundwork last unit. We're going to be using it all, okay? So,
why observe? Why explore when everything is just like
exactly.
the same?
Exactly. Why use inductive reasoning, going out and observing the universe, when everything can be explained logically? And so you actually have examples of Greek philosophers who thought, you know what, the most logical thing when it comes to orbit around the sun is that they would be a perfect circle. And so they thought, okay, that must be what it is, because that's logical. And so they would use deductive reasoning, but as we've talked about, you can't just use deductive reasoning. You have to have both. So the idea that the universe could be different meant that you actually have to go out and observe the universe. And that's very important to science, right? Observation is kind of the key tenet of science. So we can see a shift in thinking in that instead of just sitting back in our armchairs and thinking logically about the universe, people were actually going and doing experiments. They created hypotheses, and they thought, you know what, maybe I'm wrong. Because the universe could be different. Okay? So the fallibility of man, the fact that we are able to make mistakes, was very important also. So let's talk about intelligibility for a second. What is intelligibility?
That something could be known.
It's the idea that something can be known. The belief that the world, that the universe is intelligible is very important for science. Why?
Nothing can be known about the world. Why go looking for it?
Exactly. If you can't know anything about the world, if a society believes that the world is unknowable, are they going to create science? No. Okay? Now, you can actually look back at some of the quotes of these famous scientists, and you can see that they thought the world was intelligible because of the Creator. Okay, here's Johannes Kepler. He said, God wants us to recognize natural laws. And he says, God made that possible by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. In other words, they thought, you know what, we have a creator who created our mind and created the universe. And he wouldn't have created our mind to work the way it does if he didn't want us to understand the universe. And so there are actually, you can go back and read some of the quotes, Boyle especially. As I mentioned earlier, he thought that it was an act of piety. He thought it was devotional act to God to observe the universe. We'll talk about that more in just a second. But put simply, if a society doesn't believe that the universe is intelligible, that we can comprehend it, then science isn't going to come into being, right? So those are the two main answers as to the X factor. Why then, why there? Why Western Europe? Why the 1400s to the 1700s? Well, because enough people in society believed that the universe was contingent and that the universe was intelligible. Okay? All right. You'll notice there on the second half of your first page here, it says, what three metaphors were commonly used by the founders of modern science? Okay, these are the three metaphors. A book. So you can go ahead and draw that out if you would like. Put in the title there, right, just book for the first one. The book. The second one is the clock. And the third one is a governed realm. A governed realm. So these three metaphors are going to be important for our class going forward. We'll especially see the clock one, okay, when we talk in our next unit. But the early scientists, they would use these metaphors to explain the universe, okay? The first one is the book. So this is the idea that nature is like a book in which you read it and you find out information about God. So they compared the universe with Scripture. You know how we can open the Bible, we can read it and find out about God? Well, they actually looked out at the universe and they said, you know what, the universe is a second book that God wrote. We can find out about God by reading this book of nature. And this is very compatible with Scripture. There are many verses that talk about this idea. We read one of them last week, Romans 1. You guys remember that verse? Romans 1, verses 19 and 20.
I remember that.
Since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes or qualities, namely His eternal power and divine nature, Paul says, have been clearly seen through what has been made. He says we can look at the universe and we can see God's eternal nature and His divine power. Okay? This is the same idea that scientists would use. Okay, back to Robert Boyle. He never considered the possibility that the study of nature would undermine a belief in God. Instead, he, again, regarded it as an act of devotion. So the very idea that studying the universe is contradictory to faith, that's a very new concept. Okay? And again, let's not strawman the atheist here. It's not like every atheist believes that or thinks of Christians as simpletons who hate science. But that viewpoint, I think, has become so popularized that many people in our society just kind of accept it as fact, even if they don't take a side or they don't care too much. But anyway, the idea of a book, very important. Second one is the clock. So let me read you another quote from Boyle. He said, the universe is like a rare clock. All things are so skillfully contrived that the engine, being once set a-moving, all things proceed according to the artificer's design. In other words, he said, the universe is so precise in the way it functions. And it functions on its own. And this is a very important concept. It's the idea that God wound the clock up and then let it go. That's a different viewpoint than the viewpoint that God is literally working miraculously through everything that's happening. In other words, let me put it this way. If we viewed everything in the universe as happening like by a miraculous power of God, would we come to the conclusion that we can study it and understand it? No. Whereas this idea that God created the universe to work in a particular way, this leads us to want to observe, to want to figure things out. Because there are certain mechanisms at play in chemistry and biology and so on that are working together on their own, right? You have chemical reactions happening. You have all sorts of things, everything in the universe. We're able to explain each of them because God's not, sitting there doing a miracle every time. He's letting it work together. Okay, so that's an important idea that came from this metaphor that was often used. Okay, we're going to talk more about the clock metaphor next unit, but it's an important one. But think of it this way. Actually, we're almost out of time. Let's move to the governed realm real quick. This is last point. Newton, Boyle, many other scientists, they started using a terminology which is very common today. Okay, we call it laws of nature. You've heard of the laws of nature, right? Did you know where that term comes from? It comes from these first scientists they called it laws because they thought that there was a lawgiver. In other words, and this is a very biblical idea. In the Old Testament, we see it a lot, where it talks about God setting boundaries, God setting the rules for how creation ought to run. Well, the first scientists, they viewed it in this way, and they started talking about the way the earth runs as a series of laws. And they would actually point to the Creator as the lawgiver. So this is a very important concept that we're going to talk about as well. Okay, this idea that God is the lawgiver. He has set forth rules. We call them laws of physics, laws of nature, etc. And those rules are at play and can only be broken by Him, right? And that's what we would call supernatural. Anything supernatural would be anything broken by, maybe not necessarily only by Him, but by the spiritual realm. Okay, so. Put simply, the very idea that there are laws in nature comes from the belief or concept that there is a lawgiver. Okay? So these are three metaphors that they would often use, and they're going to be stuff that probably comes back throughout this class, especially the clock one will. But the point of this class is very simple. We don't need to consider science and religion as enemies. We need to consider them as compatible and working together. Obviously, our faith should be most important and paramount to us, but it's not like we should be afraid of science or consider it an enemy, right? And also, tomorrow we're going to talk about how or when this viewpoint that they are enemies actually came and started, okay? And so we're going to talk about the rise of materialism in history tomorrow. You know what materialism is?
Yes. I know this.
It's atheism in a nutshell.
Yeah.
It's the view that the universe is all there is. Okay? So, in other words, matter is all there is. There's no spiritual realm. Materialism only started to rise up in like the 1800s. Okay? And it became very popular in the 1800s and 1900s. And now, there's kind of this revisionist history going on. It's like, this is what scientists have always believed. No, it's pretty recent, okay? And we're going to talk about the rise of materialism tomorrow. All right,